Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Hey there.
So we are diving into a highly analytical, really skeptical source text today that evaluates the existence of God, atheism, and that whole messy intersection of faith and science. We're going to explore the actual mechanics of belief, asking whether prayer actually moves a divine hand, or if it's, purely psychological.
Right, exactly.
We're looking at massive scientific studies, the strange power of the placebo effect, and the logical traps hidden inside the idea of miracles. It is a really fast-paced, provocative journey right into the core of the human mind. Now, before we get completely lost in all this data, I want to take a quick second. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Yeah, it really helps us out.
It does. All right, let's get into it. I'm joined as always by our resident expert to help you, the listener, navigate these incredibly complex, philosophically charged arguments impartially. Our mission for this deep dive is to look at humanity's oldest practice, which is prayer, through a strict lens of data and logic.
I mean, it's an ambitious mission.
Right.
It is so easy to get caught up in the emotional and deeply personal aspects of belief.
Oh, absolutely.
And those are entirely valid human experiences, of course. But today we're looking at a very specific, almost clinical set of questions. Like, if we treat the claims of religion as testable hypotheses, what does the objective data actually show?
Right, taking off the theological lens for a second.
Exactly. Putting on the scientific one.
And I think we have to start with the most common everyday interaction people have with the concept of God, right? Prayer.
Yeah, undoubtedly.
Because billions of people pray.
Yeah.
And we have to acknowledge that it provides immense comfort. It gives people strength, a feeling of connection. These are real, very valid human experiences.
Okay, let's unpack this. How do we actually test if prayer moves God into action?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, is it even possible to measure? Well, the assumption for centuries was that you just couldn't test it, that it was entirely outside the realm of empirical science. But objective data from our sources actually exists. Prayer has been scientifically tested.
Wait, really? How do you even do that?
Yeah, specifically, they detail this massive study by the Templeton Foundation. And they focused on patients who were recovering from heart surgery, coronary artery bypass grafts, to be exact.
Okay, so a very serious procedure.
Very serious. They chose it because the recovery metrics are extremely clear. You either have complications or you don't. You can't fake heart surgery recovery.
That makes sense. But how do you set up a control group? If I'm in the hospital, my mom is praying for me, my friends are praying for me, how do they isolate the prayer variable?
Right. They had to solve that exact logistical nightmare. You obviously can't stop a family from praying. So researchers looked at the impact of additional standardized intercessory prayer.
Additional prayer, got it.
Yeah. Half the patients had strangers, specifically organized Christian groups, actively praying for their successful recovery.
Just strangers.
Strangers. They were given the patient's first names and last initials. And the other half, the control group, did not receive these organized prayers.
Yeah.
And it was strictly double-blind.
Meaning the doctors didn't know who was getting the prayers.
Exactly. The doctors didn't know, the patients didn't know, nobody knew.
Wow. Okay, so given that the Templeton Foundation funded this, and they usually look for harmony between faith and science, I'd assume they expected at least a small bump in recovery for the prayer group. What were the findings?
The result? There was absolutely no meaningful difference in health outcomes between the two groups.
None at all.
None. Zero.
Yeah.
The complication rates, the recovery times, they were completely identical. From a purely statistical standpoint, the intervention of prayer had a 0% impact on physical healing.
That is, wow, that is wild. But I have to push back a little here, just playing devil's advocate. I have this analogy. Is testing prayer like trying to test a Wi-Fi signal?
How do you mean?
Like, if the receiver, in this case God, doesn't want to be measured, will it ever show up in a lab? I mean, God isn't a vending machine.
That's a great analogy.
Right. But at the same time, I acknowledge that from a purely scientific standpoint, the data is what the data is.
Exactly. Theology can argue that the router is hiding its signal, but science just says, hey, my meter reads 0. If you claim prayer physically alters reality, that's a physical claim. And physical claims require physical evidence.
So if the massive scientific studies show no divine intervention, why do millions of people have genuine, visceral experiences where they feel their prayers were answered? We all know someone who prayed for something specific, and it happened.
Well, this moves us from physical data to human psychology. Human minds are incredibly desperate for consistency, right? We experience intense confirmation bias.
Ah, confirmation bias.
Yeah. We vividly remember the hits when a requested outcome happens, and we completely forget the misses, the prayers that went unanswered.
That makes total sense. If 1 million people pray to find their car keys, a few thousand will just stumble on them by pure chance.
Exactly. Statistically, with billions praying, some requests will naturally happen by pure chance. But the human brain draws a straight line of causality and filters out the failures.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Our source points out the placebo effect here. And this blew my mind because deep belief can actually produce real physical healing without any divine intervention.
Yes, the biological mechanisms are astounding.
Right. If you think you're taking a painkiller, your brain literally releases endogenous opioids. It heals itself based purely on belief.
What's fascinating here is that prayer does provide measurable, proven psychological benefits. It operates on those exact same neurological pathways.
It's like meditation.
Exactly like meditation. It reduces stress, it lowers cortisol, creates focus, and builds community.
So the comfort is real.
Very real. But just like a placebo heals without an active pharmaceutical ingredient, prayer can heal psychologically without an active God listening on the other end. The belief itself is the active ingredient.
Wow. Okay, so we transition from the everyday psychological comforts of prayer to, well, massive, inexplicable events. Because if everyday prayer is a placebo, what do we make of miracles?
Right. That's the next logical step in the source text.
First, we have to define our terms based on the source. A miracle isn't just a lucky coincidence. It's a moment where the laws of nature are entirely suspended.
That strict definition is super important.
It's like gravity deciding to take a coffee break. But science relies on the universe having consistent, repeatable rules. If the rules can be paused, are they actually rules?
This is where David Hume's classic 18th century argument comes in from the text. He formulated a probability matrix for these claims.
Okay, lay it on me.
When someone claims a miracle happened, what is logically the most probable explanation? Option A. The physical laws of the universe, which have held true for billions of years, were temporarily broken.
Right. And option B.
Option B. The human observer is mistaken, misinterpreting the event, or outright lying.
I mean, when you put it like that, human memory is notoriously terrible. Eyewitnesses get things wrong all the time.
Exactly. History completely backs up option B. The sources point out that almost all historical miracle claims, when closely investigated, turn out to be exaggerations.
Or delusions, or just deliberate frauds.
Yes. The probability of human error or deception is infinitely higher than the probability of physics just pausing.
Which leads directly to the ultimate logical and ethical problem raised by atheistic and skeptical thinkers in the text. Let's say God can suspend the rules. Why is the intervention so wildly selective?
This is the problem of selective protection. It's a huge stumbling block.
Yeah, the text brings up striking examples. Someone survives a terrible airplane crash and thanks God for protecting them. But why didn't God protect the others who perished?
Right, or the medical examples.
Exactly. A person is cured of cancer and they praise God, but millions of children are left to suffer and die from preventable diseases. Why the selective intervention?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at how religious believers usually counter this inconsistency.
Which is usually what? The mystery argument.
Yeah, exactly. They say God's plan is beyond our human understanding, that the survivor had a purpose and the victim's deaths were part of some grand, mysterious tapestry.
So what does this all mean? Because there is a fatal flaw in that defense. If literally every possible outcome, good or brutally tragic, can be explained away as God's plan, then the claim becomes completely unfalsifiable.
It does. It becomes the scientific death knell for the argument.
Right, because if you survive, it's God's plan. If you die, it's God's plan. You can't ever prove it wrong.
And an unfalsifiable claim is entirely unscientific. In logic, if no amount of evidence can ever disprove a claim, then the claim itself is fundamentally weak.
It proves absolutely nothing.
Right. A theory that explains literally everything actually explains nothing at all.
Man, this has been an incredibly heavy deep dive. Just to briefly recap the journey for you, the listener, we moved from the very real psychological comforts of personal prayer.
Which are valid and helpful.
Absolutely. Then we went through the rigorous clinical tests of the Templeton Foundation, which showed no physical intervention.
Just flat data.
Then we looked at the biology of the placebo effect, past David Hume's 18th century skepticism about miracles, and finally landed on the philosophical dead end of God's plan and unfalsifiability.
This raises an important question.
It does. And we want to leave you with a direct, Haunting question taken straight from the climax of the source text to mull over. If God truly hears all prayers, what is the underlying logic of which ones get answered?
It's a tough thing to wrestle with.
And more pointedly, why do the prayers of starving children seemingly go unanswered? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.